The afternoon sun was starting to dip lower in the sky when 12-year-old Keisha walked out of Riverside Middle School. She adjusted her backpack on her shoulders and smiled to herself. It had been a good day. She'd gotten an A on her science project about earthquakes, and her best friend had shared her lunch cookies during recess. Life was simple and sweet when you were 12 years old. Keisha pulled out her phone as she walked down the familiar sidewalk toward home. She was texting her mom, but not in the way most kids did. Her fingers moved across the screen, selecting emojis and pictures that communicated what she wanted to say. A house emoji, then a clock showing 30 minutes, then a thumbs up. Mom would understand. She always did. The thing about Keisha was that she'd been deaf since the day she was born. She couldn't hear the birds chirping in the trees above her. She couldn't hear the distant sound of lawnmowers or the rumble of cars passing by. But she didn't feel like she was missing anything. This was her normal. This was her world. She felt the vibrations of her footsteps. She felt the warm breeze on her face. She watched the leaves dancing on the sidewalk, crunching beneath her sneakers. The neighborhood where Keisha lived was quiet and peaceful. Tree-lined streets with neat houses, trimmed lawns, and flower gardens. She'd walked this route hundreds of times, past Mrs. Chen's house with the bird feeders, past the Johnsons' place with their golden retriever who always barked at the window, past the corner store where she sometimes stopped to buy candy with her allowance. Today felt like every other day. Ordinary, safe, comfortable. What Keisha didn't know was that someone was watching her. Old Mr. Henley from 3 houses down had been sitting on his porch when he saw her walking. He didn't recognize her, even though she'd lived in the neighborhood for 12 years. He squinted at her through his thick glasses, watching as she looked at different houses while walking, her head turning left and right as she took in the afternoon scenery. To Mr. Henley, something seemed off. Why was this girl looking at houses so carefully? Why did she keep stopping and pulling out her phone? His mind, clouded by years of watching too much crime television and listening to too many neighborhood watch meetings, jumped to the worst conclusion. She must be casing the neighborhood, looking for houses to rob, making notes on her phone about which ones to target. He shuffled inside and called 911. Meanwhile, Keisha had stopped to look at a butterfly that had landed on a mailbox. She loved butterflies. She watched it open and close its orange and black wings, completely mesmerized by the simple beauty of nature. After a moment, it flew away and she continued walking, completely unaware that patrol car number 47 had just received a call about a suspicious person in the area. Officer Bradley Richards had been on the force for 8 years.
He considered himself a good cop, someone who protected his community.
When the call came through about a possible burglary suspect, his training kicked in. The description was vague, a young person in a red hoodie and jeans, but it was enough. He spotted Keisha 2 blocks later. "That's got to be her," he said to his partner, Officer David Chen, who was driving. They began following her slowly, keeping their distance. Officer Chen radioed in their position. Officer Richards watched as Keisha kept walking, kept looking at her phone, kept glancing at the houses around her. To him, every innocent action looked suspicious. Every normal behavior seemed like evidence of criminal intent. "She's definitely casing these houses," Richards said with certainty. "Look at how she keeps stopping and checking her phone. Probably has a list." The truth was so much simpler and so much more innocent. Keisha had paused because she thought she felt her phone vibrate. She was checking to see if her mom had texted back. When there was no message, she tucked the phone back in her pocket and kept walking, humming a song in her mind that she couldn't hear out loud. Officer Chen flipped on the sirens. The loud wail cut through the quiet neighborhood. Dogs started barking. People looked out their windows. But Keisha just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, completely oblivious to the chaos beginning to unfold behind her. "Why isn't she stopping?" Richard said, his voice getting tighter. "We've got the sirens on. The lights are flashing. She's ignoring us." "Maybe she has headphones in," Chen suggested, though he couldn't see any. "Doesn't matter. Protocol says we approach," Richards replied, his hand moving to rest on his weapon. The patrol car pulled up fast, tires squealing slightly as it came to a stop just behind Keisha. Both officers jumped out, their doors slamming with force. The sound echoed down the street. Keisha felt the vibration through the sidewalk, felt something was different. But before she could even turn around, a hand grabbed her shoulder hard and spun her around. The world seemed to move in slow motion. One moment, Keisha was thinking about what she wanted for dinner. The next moment, she was staring at two police officers, and both of them had their guns drawn and pointed directly at her face. Her heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes went wide with pure terror. She'd never seen a real gun pointed at anyone before, let alone at herself. The barrels looked enormous, like tunnels leading to darkness. The officers' faces were twisted with anger and something that looked like fear. Their mouths were moving rapidly, shouting something, but of course Keisha couldn't hear a single word. Her hands flew up instinctively. Not in surrender, though that's what most people would have done. No. Keisha's hands moved in the pattern she'd been taught since she was a toddler. Her fingers formed shapes and symbols, moving frantically in the air between her and the officers. She was signing as fast as she could, trying to tell them the most important thing they needed to know. "I'm deaf. I can't hear you. I'm deaf." But Officer Richards didn't know sign language. He'd never been trained to recognize it. To him, this 12-year-old girl's rapid hand movements looked aggressive, threatening, like she was making gang signs or trying to signal to accomplices he couldn't see. "Stop moving your hands," he shouted even louder than before, as if volume could somehow bridge the gap between them. "Put your hands up and stop moving." Keisha's eyes filled with tears. She didn't understand what was happening. Why were the police, the people her mother had always told her to trust, pointing guns at her? Why did they look so angry? What had she done wrong? She tried again, signing more slowly, more deliberately, hoping they would understand. "I am deaf." Officer Chen was now on his radio, his voice urgent. "We need backup. Suspect is non-compliant and making threatening gestures. Corner of Maple and 5th. The word suspect hung in the air like poison. Keisha wasn't a suspect. She was a child walking home from school. But in that moment, she'd been transformed in the eyes of these officers into something dangerous, something that needed to be controlled, something that might need to be stopped by any means necessary. Keisha remembered her mom's emergency card, the one she always kept in her front pocket. It was laminated and had big letters that said, "I am deaf," along with her mom's phone number and emergency information. If she could just reach for it, she could show them, and this nightmare would end. Her hand started to move toward her pocket. "She's reaching for something," Officer Richards yelled. "Keep your hands where I can see them." But Keisha couldn't hear him. Her hand kept moving, inches away from the pocket that held her salvation, the card that would explain everything. Behind the officers, more sirens were wailing in the distance, getting closer. Backup was coming. The situation was escalating by the second, spiraling out of control faster than anyone could stop it. Neighbors were starting to emerge from their houses now. Mrs. Patterson from next door recognized Keisha immediately. She started screaming, her voice shrill with panic. "That's Keisha. She lives here. She's just a baby. She's deaf." But the officers were too focused, too locked into their perception of threat to hear the neighbors' desperate pleas. Everything they'd been trained to do in a high-stress situation was kicking in, and none of that training had prepared them for this moment. None of it had taught them to look for the signs they were missing. None of it had shown them how to recognize that the threat they perceived was actually just a terrified child who couldn't hear their commands and didn't understand why her ordinary day had turned into a waking nightmare. 3 more police cars were now screaming down the street, lights flashing red and blue against the houses, transforming the quiet suburban afternoon into something that looked like a crime scene from a movie. Keisha stood frozen, her hands still raised, tears streaming down her brown cheeks, her whole body shaking. She was 12 years old and she had guns pointed at her face, and she had no idea why. Time seemed to stretch and bend in the worst possible way. Seconds felt like hours. Keisha's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The afternoon sun that had felt so warm and pleasant just minutes ago now felt harsh and blinding. Everything was wrong. Everything was terrifying, and she had no way to make them understand. Officer Richards kept his weapon steady, pointed at this small girl who barely came up to his shoulder. His training told him to maintain control of the situation. His instincts told him something was off, but he'd already committed to seeing her as a threat. Sometimes the human mind does that. Once it decides something is dangerous, it filters everything through that lens. Every innocent action becomes evidence. Every natural response becomes suspicious. "I said, stop moving your hands." Richard shouted again, his voice getting hoarse from yelling. Sweat was beading on his forehead. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Suspects were supposed to comply. They were supposed to follow orders. Why was this girl being so difficult? Keisha's hands were still up, but they were shaking now. She could see more police cars arriving. Could see more officers getting out with their hands on their weapons. She could see neighbors gathering, pointing, some with their phones out. The world felt like it was closing in on her. She tried to remember what her mom had taught her. Stay calm, try to communicate. Don't make sudden movements. But how could she stay calm when everything inside her was screaming to run? Officer Chen lowered his weapon slightly, just slightly, and something in his gut told him this wasn't right. He'd been a cop for 6 years, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. This didn't feel like a burglary suspect. This felt different. Wrong. The girl looked terrified, genuinely terrified, not like someone who'd been caught in the act of planning a crime. "Richards," he said quietly, "something's not right here." "She's not complying with direct orders," Richards shot back, not taking his eyes off Keisha. "That's resisting." 3 more officers had joined them now, forming a semicircle around this child. 6 grown men, all armed, all focused on one 12-year-old girl. The ratio was absurd. The scene was absurd. But nobody seemed to notice just how wrong it all was. Mrs. Patterson was still shouting from her lawn, waving her arms frantically. "She's deaf. Can't you see? She's deaf. She can't hear you." Another neighbor had joined her now, Mr. Williams from across the street. He knew Keisha too. He'd watched her grow up, had given her family their old bicycle when his kids outgrew it. "That's the Lawson's daughter. She goes to Riverside Middle School. She's a good kid." But the officers were in their bubble now, that focused tunnel vision that happens in high-stress situations. The outside voices weren't getting through. They were locked onto their target, following their training, doing everything by the book, except the book had never prepared them for this. The book had no chapter on deaf children, no protocol for communication barriers, no guidance for when the suspect isn't actually a suspect at all. Keisha's tears were flowing freely now. She tried again to sign, slower this time, more deliberate. Her hands formed the letters of her name, Keisha. Then she pointed to herself. Then she made the sign for deaf again, touching her ear and then her mouth. It was such a simple, clear gesture. But to Officer Richards it just looked like more defiant movement. "Last warning," he shouted. "Hands up and stop moving them." But her hands were up. They'd been up the whole time. She was doing exactly what he wanted. She just didn't know he wanted her to freeze them in place like statues. How could she know when she couldn't hear him? How could she follow orders she couldn't receive? A young officer who'd just arrived, barely 23 years old and fresh out of the academy, stepped closer. His name was Officer Mitchell, and this was his first real call that wasn't a traffic stop. His hands were shaking as he gripped his weapon. He'd been trained to watch the hands. That's what they always said in the academy. Watch the hands. The hands are where the danger comes from, and this girl's hands wouldn't stop moving. "She keeps reaching," Mitchell said nervously to Officer Chen. "Is she signaling to someone?" Officer Chen was looking around now, scanning the growing crowd, looking for accomplices that didn't exist. This whole thing felt wrong to him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on why. His radio crackled with more units asking if they needed additional backup. Keisha's mom, Rita Lawson, was at the grocery store when her phone started buzzing. Not with a text from Keisha saying she was home safe, but with a call from Mrs. Patterson, her voice frantic and barely coherent. Rita, you need to get home right now. The police have Keisha surrounded. They have guns on her." Rita's shopping basket fell from her hands. Apples and oranges rolled across the floor. What are you talking about?" "Just come home, hurry." Rita ran out of the store, leaving her cart abandoned in the aisle. Her hands fumbled with her car keys. Her mind was racing. This had to be a mistake. Some kind of misunderstanding. Keisha was deaf, yes, but everyone in the neighborhood knew that. Everyone knew her daughter. This couldn't be happening. Back at the scene, a supervisor had arrived. Sergeant Linda Torres had been with the department for 15 years. She pulled up and immediately assessed the situation. 6 officers, weapons drawn, surrounding what looked like a young teenager. She got out of her car with authority. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Officer Richards briefed her quickly. Call came in about a suspicious person casing houses. "We located the suspect matching the description. She's refusing to comply with orders and making threatening gestures. Sergeant Torres looked at Keisha, really looked at her. She saw a child in a school backpack covered with cartoon characters. She saw tears streaming down a young face. She saw fear, pure and absolute. And she saw hands moving in patterns that looked familiar somehow. "Is she saying something?" Torres asked. "She won't stop moving her hands," Richard said. "We've ordered her multiple times to freeze." Torres took a few steps closer, holstering her own weapon. Something clicked in her memory. Her cousin was deaf. She'd been to family gatherings where people signed. Those hand movements, they weren't threats. They were language. "Oh my God," Torres said softly. "She's signing. She's using sign language." The words hung in the air. Several officers looked confused. Officer Chen's face went pale as the realization hit him. Officer Richards blinked, his certainty wavering for the first time. "What?" Richards said. "She's deaf," Torres said, louder now, her voice carrying an edge of horror at what had almost happened. "She can't hear you. She's been trying to tell you she's deaf this whole time." The shift in energy was immediate. What had been a tense standoff suddenly felt like something else entirely. Something terrible. Several officers lowered their weapons, uncertainty replacing their earlier confidence. Officer Mitchell looked like he might be sick, but the damage was done. Keisha had been standing there, surrounded by armed officers for nearly 8 minutes now. 8 minutes that felt like a lifetime. 8 minutes where anything could have gone wrong. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, one nervous trigger finger, and this story would have ended very differently. Sergeant Torres moved forward slowly, making sure Keisha could see her clearly. She holstered her weapon completely and held her hands out in a calming gesture. She pointed to her ear and shook her head, trying to communicate that she understood. She made the universal symbol for okay with her fingers, then pointed to Keisha. Keisha saw this and nodded frantically, relief flooding through her body so intensely that her knees almost gave out. Someone understood. Finally, someone understood. Torres turned to Officer Richards. "Check her backpack carefully." Richards approached slowly now, his whole demeanor changed. He walked around behind Keisha, and that's when he saw it. Right there on the back of her backpack, sewn into the fabric in bright yellow and black, was a patch. A medical alert symbol, and under it, in clear letters, "I am deaf." It had been there the entire time. Visible to anyone who looked. Anyone who'd bothered to see this child as a person rather than a threat would have noticed it immediately. But they'd approached from behind with their minds already made up, their narrative already written. Officer Richards felt his stomach drop. His hands were shaking now as he holstered his weapon. "Sir, there's a medical alert on her bag. Says she's deaf." The neighborhood had gone quiet except for the crackle of police radios. Mrs. Patterson was crying on her lawn. Mr. Williams had his arm around her. Other neighbors stood frozen, their phones still recording everything, capturing every moment of this catastrophe. Officer Chen approached Keisha from the front, moving slowly. He pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app. With shaking fingers, he typed, "Are you okay?" "We are sorry. We didn't know." He held the phone out where Keisha could see it. She read the words and shook her head. No, she wasn't okay. How could she be okay? She read the words again. Sorry, they were sorry. But sorry didn't erase the terror. Sorry didn't erase the image of guns pointed at her face. Sorry didn't make her feel safe again. More cars were pulling up now, but these weren't police cars. One was Rita's beat-up Honda, screeching to a stop with the door flying open before the car was even fully stopped. Rita Lawson ran toward her daughter, and several officers moved to intercept her, but Sergeant Torres waved them off. "Let her through. That's gotta be the mother." Rita pushed past the officers and grabbed Keisha, pulling her into a fierce hug. Keisha collapsed into her mother's arms, her whole body shaking with sobs. Rita was signing rapidly, asking if she was hurt, asking what happened, her own tears mixing with her daughter's. The officers stood there, watching this reunion, and the weight of what they'd done was starting to sink in. This wasn't a burglary suspect. This wasn't a criminal. This was a child who'd been walking home from school, a child who couldn't hear them, a child who'd been terrorized by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Officer Richards removed his hat and ran his hand through his hair. His 8 years on the force had never prepared him for this moment. The moment when you realize you're not the hero of the story, you're the villain, and there's no taking it back. Just 3 blocks away, Mayor Patricia Williams was sitting in the back of her official car, reviewing notes from the community meeting she'd just left. It had been a productive afternoon discussing new sidewalk repairs and traffic light installations. Normal city business, the kind of thing that actually made a difference in people's daily lives, even if it didn't make headlines. Her driver, Jerome, had worked for the city for 12 years and knew every shortcut through town. He was taking them through a residential area when he noticed the unusual number of police cars ahead, their lights painting the quiet street in splashes of red and blue. "Something's going on up there." "Mayor," Jerome said, slowing down. Mayor Williams looked up from her notes. She'd been in office for 3 years and she'd seen plenty of police situations. Usually she stayed out of the way. Let the professionals do their jobs. But something about this scene made her pause. The sheer number of vehicles, the crowd of neighbors, the way everyone seemed to be filming. "Pull over," she said. "Let me see what's happening." As they got closer, Mayor Williams could see the center of all the attention. Officers with weapons, a semicircle formation, and in the middle, someone small, very small, child-sized. "Dear God," she whispered. "Jerome, get me closer now." The car pulled up to the edge of the scene and Mayor Williams was out before Jerome could even put it in park. Her security detail scrambled to follow her, but she was already moving with purpose toward the cluster of officers. She was a tall woman, nearly 6 feet, with a presence that commanded attention even without her title, and right now that presence was radiating barely controlled fury. She recognized Sergeant Torres first. What in God's name is happening here? Torres turned, surprise and relief flooding her face. "Mayor Williams, we've had a situation. There's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Mayor Williams's voice cut through the air. She could see past the officers now, see the young girl being held by a woman who had to be her mother, see the tears, see the backpacks, see the school uniform. "Someone explain to me right now why there are 6 officers with weapons drawn on what appears to be a middle school student." The officers were starting to holster their weapons now, the arrival of the mayor adding another layer of reality to what had just happened. This wasn't just going to be an internal report anymore. This was going to be something much bigger. Officer Richard stepped forward, his face pale. "Ma'am, we received a call about a suspicious person in the neighborhood. We responded and attempted to make contact with the individual, but she refused to comply with our orders." Mayor Williams walked closer, and that's when her heart nearly stopped. She knew this child. Not well, but she knew her. The memory came flooding back in crystal clarity. 4 months ago, the city's annual Youth Achievement Awards. There had been a special category for students with disabilities who'd excelled in academics or arts. And the winner in the art category had been a young deaf girl from Riverside Middle School. She'd created this beautiful painting of the city skyline using mixed media and bright colors that seemed to dance off the canvas. Mayor Williams had personally presented that award, had shaken this girl's hand, had smiled for photos with her and her proud mother. The girl's name was Keisha Lawson. "Stand down," Mayor Williams said, her voice dropping to something quiet and dangerous. "All of you stand down immediately." "Ma'am, we've already—" Officer Richard started. "I said stand down." The mayor's voice cracked like a whip. "Do you know who you just pointed weapons at? Do you have any idea?" The officers looked at each other, confused and worried. Mayor Williams walked past them, directly to where Rita Lawson was still holding her daughter. Both of them looked up at her approach, and recognition flickered in Rita's eyes. "Mrs. Lawson," Mayor Williams said softly, "I'm so deeply sorry. Is Keisha all right? Is she hurt?" Rita's face crumpled with a mixture of relief and anguish. Someone in authority was finally seeing them as human beings. "She's not hurt physically. But Mayor Williams, they pointed guns at my baby. My 12-year-old deaf daughter had guns pointed at her face because she couldn't hear their orders." The mayor knelt down so she was eye level with Keisha. The girl was still crying, still shaking, clinging to her mother like a lifeline. Mayor Williams made sure she had Keisha's attention, then she started to sign. Her signing wasn't perfect, she was rusty and slow, but she'd learned basic sign language years ago when she'd worked in disability advocacy before entering politics. "I am so sorry," she signed carefully. "You are safe now. I promise you are safe." Keisha's eyes widened. Someone in authority could talk to her, could actually communicate with her in her own language. She nodded slightly, fresh tears rolling down her cheeks. Mayor Williams stood and turned back to the officers, and her expression had transformed from compassionate to absolutely livid. She walked directly to Officer Richards, who instinctively straightened up. "Turn around," she said. "Ma'am?" I said, "Turn around." "Look at that child's backpack." Richards turned, and there it was. The medical alert patch that had been there all along. The bright yellow and black symbol that should have been impossible to miss. The words "I am deaf" in letters big enough to read from several feet away. That patch, Mayor Williams said, her voice shaking with controlled rage, was on her back this entire time. This child has been wearing her medical alert since the moment you encountered her. Did any of you think to look? Did any of you think to check for identification? Did any of you consider that maybe, just maybe, there was a reason she wasn't responding to your verbal commands? The silence was deafening. Sergeant Torres spoke up. "Mayor, they approached from behind and—" "There is no excuse," Williams cut her off. "None. I don't care what the call was about. I don't care what training they followed. 6 armed officers surrounded a 12-year-old girl who was walking home from school, and not one of them recognized the signs that she was deaf. Not one of them saw that medical alert. Not one of them thought to de-escalate instead of pulling weapons. More neighbors were gathering now, and several were calling out their support for the mayor. Mrs. Patterson shouted, "She's been living here for 12 years. Everyone knows Keisha." Mayor Williams pointed at Mrs. Patterson. "Thank you. Yes, this child has lived in this neighborhood her entire life. She walks this route every single day. She's known to this community. And yet a single phone call from someone who didn't recognize her turned into this disaster. Officer Mitchell, the young rookie, looked like he might pass out. This was supposed to be a routine call, his first real test as an officer. And instead it had become a nightmare. He'd pointed his weapon at a child, a deaf child. The weight of it was crushing. Jerome, the mayor's driver, had been filming the last few minutes on his phone. Not the confrontation with Keisha that had already happened, but the mayor's response. He knew this footage would be important. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about something bigger. Mayor Williams pulled out her own phone and made a call. "Chief Howard? It's Patricia Williams. I need you to meet me at 547 Maple Street immediately. We have a serious situation that requires your personal attention." She paused, listening. "I don't care what meeting you're in. Get here now." "This is not a request." She hung up and turned back to Rita and Keisha. "Mrs. Lawson, I know this is traumatic, but I need to ask you some questions. And I need to document what happened here today, not just for accountability, but because I'm going to make sure this never happens to another child in our city. Can you tell me exactly what happened from your daughter's perspective?" Rita nodded, and with Keisha still pressed against her side, she began to explain. How Keisha had just been walking home like normal. How she'd been looking at butterflies and checking her phone for messages from her mom. How the police had grabbed her from behind without warning. How she'd tried desperately to tell them she was deaf. But they'd interpreted her signing as threats. As Rita spoke, other neighbors added their accounts. Mrs. Patterson described how she'd screamed from her yard that Keisha was deaf. Mr. Williams explained how he'd tried to tell the officers they had the wrong person. Another neighbor, a teenager named Devin who was home from college, showed the mayor his phone. He'd filmed the entire thing starting from when the first officers grabbed Keisha. "Can you send that to me?" Mayor Williams asked. "And also don't delete it. That's evidence." Devin nodded and started sharing the video. Within seconds, it was already spreading. He'd uploaded it to social media during the incident, and it was starting to go viral. People were sharing it with captions like, "Police terrorize deaf child," and "This is why we need reform." Police Chief Howard arrived 15 minutes later, his face grim. Mayor Williams met him before he even got out of his car. "Chief, we need to talk privately. Then you need to talk to these officers, and you need to talk to this family. But first you need to understand the magnitude of what just happened here." She walked him away from the crowd and laid it out. The 911 call based on nothing but a girl looking at houses while walking home. The response that treated a child as a threat. The failure to recognize obvious medical alerts. The escalation instead of de-escalation. The fact that if she hadn't happened to be driving through this neighborhood at this exact moment, this situation could have ended very differently. "Patricia," Chief Howard said quietly, using her first name in a rare moment of informality. "How bad is it?" "It's on video, Tom, all of it. And it's already viral. By tonight, everyone in the country is going to know what happened on this street, to this child, in our city." The chief looked over at the scene. At the officers who were standing around looking lost and scared. At the young girl still clinging to her mother. At the neighbors who were angry and filming and not going anywhere. He'd been a cop for 30 years. He'd seen a lot. But this was different. This was the kind of mistake that ended careers. That changed departments. That changed cities. "We need to make this right," he said. "There is no making this right," Mayor Williams replied. "That child will never forget having guns pointed at her face. Her mother will never forget the terror of knowing her daughter was seconds away from potential tragedy. But what we can do is make sure it never happens again. We can reform. We can train. We can change. And we can hold people accountable." She walked back to the Lawson family. Keisha was calmer now, but still shaken. Rita was holding her daughter like she might never let go. "Mrs. Lawson, Chief Howard is here. I want you to know that we're going to do a full investigation. We're going to review every second of what happened, and we're going to make changes. Real changes. Not just words and promises. Actual policy changes that will protect other children like Keisha." Rita looked up at the mayor with exhausted eyes. "Will it matter? Will anything really change?" It was the question that hung over everything. The question that had been asked after every incident like this in every city, for years and years. Would this time be different? Mayor Williams looked at Keisha, at this beautiful child who should have been home eating a snack and doing homework. Not traumatized on a sidewalk surrounded by police and cameras. "I'm going to make it matter," she said. "I give you my word." The video went viral faster than anyone expected. By 8 o'clock that evening, it had been shared over 100,000 times. By midnight, it was trending nationwide. By morning, news trucks from 3 states were parked outside the Lawson house in City Hall. The footage was devastating. It showed everything. A young girl walking peacefully, police cars arriving with sirens blaring, officers jumping out with weapons drawn. And most damning of all, it showed Keisha trying desperately to communicate through sign language while officers yelled commands she couldn't hear. The body camera footage that was released later showed the medical alert patch clearly visible on her backpack, ignored by everyone. Rita Lawson couldn't sleep that night. She sat in Keisha's room, watching her daughter finally rest after crying herself into exhaustion. Every time Keisha had closed her eyes, she'd seen those guns again. Felt that terror again. Rita had never felt more helpless in her entire life. She'd spent 12 years teaching her daughter that the world was safe, that people were good, that the police were helpers. And in 8 minutes, all of that had shattered. Her phone buzzed constantly. Friends, family, news reporters, lawyers. Everyone wanted to talk. Everyone had opinions. But Rita just wanted her daughter to feel safe again. At the police station, Chief Howard called an emergency meeting. Every officer on duty was called in. The ones involved in the incident sat at the front, looking like they wished they could disappear. Officer Richards hadn't gone home. He'd been sitting in his car in the parking lot for 3 hours, replaying everything in his mind. How had he gotten it so wrong? "We have a serious problem," Chief Howard began, his voice heavy. "And I'm not just talking about the public relations nightmare, though that's real. I'm talking about a fundamental failure in how we're trained and how we respond to our community." He pulled up the video on the screen, made everyone watch it again, made them see what the public was seeing. A child terrorized by police. It was brutal to watch. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This could have been prevented at multiple points, Howard continued. The initial 911 call was from someone who didn't recognize a neighborhood kid and jumped to assumptions. That happens. But what happened next, that's on us. We had 6 officers respond to a call about a possible burglary suspect who was described as a young person in a red hoodie. We didn't ask for more details. We didn't verify the threat level. We just went in ready for confrontation. Officer Chen raised his hand. "Chief, we followed protocol." The suspect wasn't complying with orders. The suspect was a 12-year-old deaf girl, Howard's voice rose, and she had a medical alert visible on her backpack that not one of you noticed. She was using sign language that not one of you recognized. Neighbors were shouting that she was deaf and none of you listened. At what point does protocol become an excuse for not thinking? The room went silent. Sergeant Torres spoke up. "Chief, I recognize the signing, but not until I arrived later. We need better training. Real training. Not just a 1-hour seminar about disabilities. Actual practical training about how to communicate with deaf individuals, how to recognize medical alerts, how to de-escalate. Agreed, Howard said. Which is why, effective immediately, we're implementing major changes. But first we need to talk about accountability. That word hung in the air like a storm cloud. Officer Richards knew what was coming. He'd known since the moment Mayor Williams arrived. Since the moment he saw that patch on Keisha's backpack and realized what he'd done. The next morning, the Lawson family held a press conference. They didn't want to. Rita hated the cameras and the attention. But their lawyer, a woman named Joyce Henderson who specialized in civil rights cases, convinced them that controlling the narrative was important. That Keisha's story could help other people. The community center was packed. Reporters from everywhere. Local residents showing support.
Advocacy groups for the deaf and disabled communities.
Mayor Williams sat with the family, showing solidarity in a way that some politicians never would. Rita spoke first, reading from a statement with Keisha sitting beside her. An interpreter stood nearby, signing everything for the deaf community members who had come to show support. My daughter is 12 years old. She loves art class and butterflies and spending time with her friends. She's never been in trouble. She's never done anything wrong. And 3 days ago, she was walking home from school when police officers surrounded her with guns because she couldn't hear them yelling at her. Rita's voice cracked, but she pushed through.
Keisha has been deaf since birth.
We've worked so hard to teach her that she can do anything, that her disability doesn't define her, that she's safe in this world. And in 8 minutes, she learned that none of that might be true. That the color of her skin and her inability to hear can be seen as threats. That the people who are supposed to protect her might be the ones she needs protection from. The room was absolutely silent, except for the clicking of camera shutters. Then Keisha stood up. Her mom looked surprised. They hadn't planned for this. But Keisha had something to say, and she was going to say it. The interpreter moved closer as Keisha began to sign, her hands moving with determination despite their slight trembling. Why didn't they see me as a little girl? The interpreter spoke Keisha's words. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just walking home, just being myself. But they looked at me and saw something scary, something dangerous. I wanted to tell them I couldn't hear. I tried so hard to tell them. But they wouldn't look at me. Not really. They just saw what they wanted to see. Keisha paused, wiping her eyes. I'm scared now. I'm scared of police. I'm scared to walk home from school. I'm scared that next time there won't be a mayor driving by to save me. And that's not how a kid should feel. That's not how anyone should feel. The impact of a child speaking truth to power was profound. Several reporters were wiping their eyes. The interpreter's voice had broken with emotion. And across the country, people watching the news saw this brave young girl refusing to be silent about what happened to her. Mayor Williams spoke next, and she didn't pull punches. What happened to Keisha Lawson was a failure at every level. A failure of training, a failure of awareness, a failure of basic human observation. And while I can't undo the trauma she experienced, I can promise this community that we will do everything in our power to make sure it never happens again. She outlined her plans. Mandatory disability awareness training for all officers. Not just a quick seminar, but intensive ongoing education. Sign language classes offered through the police academy. New protocols for responding to individuals who might have disabilities. Medical alert recognition training. De-escalation techniques that prioritize communication over confrontation. We're also establishing a civilian oversight committee, Williams continued. And I've asked Mrs. Rita Lawson to chair that committee. Who better to help us see our blind spots than someone who's experienced them firsthand? Rita looked surprised but nodded. She'd do it. For Keisha. For every other deaf kid who might face this someday, the press conference was just the beginning. The investigation into what happened took 3 weeks. They interviewed everyone, reviewed all the footage, examined all the protocols, and what they found was disturbing. The department had received basic disability awareness training 5 years ago, one 4-hour session that most officers barely remembered. There was nothing in their protocols specifically addressing communication with deaf individuals. Medical alert recognition wasn't part of their standard training. And the culture of the department emphasized control and compliance over understanding and de-escalation. Officer Bradley Richards was terminated. The final report found that he'd failed to adequately assess the situation, had ignored obvious signs of disability, and had escalated rather than de-escalated when confronted with what he perceived as non-compliance. His 8 years of service ended in disgrace. his career destroyed by 8 minutes of terrible judgment. Officer Chen was suspended for 30 days without pay and required to complete extensive training before reinstatement. The review board felt he'd shown some awareness that something was wrong, but had failed to act on that instinct. He'd have to prove he'd learned from this mistake. The other officers received written reprimands and mandatory training. Officer Mitchell, the young rookie, requested to be transferred to a community outreach position. He couldn't carry a weapon anymore without thinking about pointing it at Keisha. He needed to do something different, something that actually helped people instead of terrifying them. Sergeant Torres was commended for recognizing the signing and de-escalating once she arrived, but she was also required to complete additional training on disability awareness for supervisors. She'd gotten there too late. She should have seen the signs sooner. The city council voted unanimously to settle the civil rights lawsuit filed by the Lawson family. The amount wasn't disclosed, but it was substantial, enough to pay for Keisha's college education and therapy and whatever else she might need to heal from this trauma. But money couldn't fix everything. Keisha started having nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night feeling like she couldn't breathe, seeing guns in her dreams. Her grades started slipping at school. She didn't want to walk anywhere alone. The confident, happy girl who loved butterflies in art class became quiet and anxious. Rita found a therapist who specialized in trauma and who knew sign language. Dr. Lauren Phillips had worked with deaf individuals for 20 years. She understood that Keisha's trauma had layers: the immediate terror of the guns, the deeper wound of not being understood, the complicated feelings about her deafness, about her race, about her place in the world. What happened to you wasn't your fault, Dr. Phillips signed during one of their sessions. You didn't do anything wrong. Not one single thing. The adults around you failed. The system failed. But you, Keisha, you did everything right. You tried to communicate. You stayed as calm as you could. You survived. And that matters. Slowly, painfully, Keisha started to heal. It wasn't linear. Some days were better than others. But with therapy and her mother's unwavering support and a community that had rallied around her, she began to feel a little safer, a little more like herself. The community didn't forget. Protests happened, not violent but persistent. People marched with signs that read "See Keisha" and "Deaf Lives Matter" and "Train Better." The local deaf community organized awareness events. Schools brought in speakers to talk about disability and inclusion and unconscious bias. And something remarkable started to happen. The conversation spread beyond just this one incident. Other stories came out. Other deaf individuals who'd had frightening encounters with police. Other disabled people who'd been misunderstood or mistreated. The issue was bigger than anyone had realized, and Keisha's story had opened the door to addressing it. 6 months after the incident, the new police training program launched. Real, substantial training developed in partnership with deaf advocacy groups and disability rights organizations. Officers learned not just facts about disabilities, but how to actually interact with disabled individuals, how to recognize signs, how to communicate, how to see people as people first, not as threats. Every patrol car now carried laminated cards with basic communication techniques for various disabilities. Visual alert systems were installed at key intersections around the city. The police department hired its first deaf liaison officer, a young woman named Crystal who'd grown up in the deaf community and wanted to bridge the gap between law enforcement and disability communities. Change was happening, real measurable change. But for Keisha, sitting in Dr. Phillips's office working through her trauma one session at a time, it still felt too little and too late. The damage had been done. The innocence had been stolen. And no amount of policy changes could give that back to her. 1 year after the incident, Keisha stood in front of a classroom full of police academy recruits. She was 13 now, a year older but carrying experiences that had aged her beyond her years. Her mom stood beside her, ready to interpret if needed, though Keisha had insisted on speaking for herself through her interpreter. This wasn't easy. Every time she saw a police uniform, her heart still raced. Every time she heard about a police encounter, her palms got sweaty. The trauma was still there, probably would always be there in some form. But Dr. Phillips had helped her understand something important. She could be scared and brave at the same time. She could be hurt and still help others. "My name is Keisha Lawson," the interpreter spoke as Keisha signed. A year ago, 6 police officers pointed guns at me because I couldn't hear them. I was 12 years old. I was walking home from school. I was just being a kid. But I'm deaf and they didn't know what that meant. The recruits sat in uncomfortable silence. They'd all seen the video. It was part of their required training now. They'd watched this girl try to communicate, watched her terror, watched how badly things could go wrong when officers didn't understand disability. I'm not here to make you feel bad, Keisha continued. I'm here to help you understand. Being deaf isn't scary. It's just different. I can't hear sirens. I can't hear someone shouting behind me. I can't hear orders being yelled. But I can see. I can communicate. I can understand if someone takes the time to communicate with me. She walked them through what that day had felt like from her perspective. The confusion, the terror, the desperate attempt to explain something that should have been obvious. She showed them the medical alert patch on her backpack, the same one she still wore every day. This was visible the whole time, she signed. But nobody looked. Nobody really looked at me and saw a person. They saw a threat. They saw someone not following orders. They didn't see a deaf child who was confused and scared. One recruit, a young woman named Officer Trainee Rebecca Nash, raised her hand. What could we have done differently? What would have helped? Keisha smiled slightly. That was exactly the right question. Look first. Really look. Check for medical alerts. Watch how someone is trying to communicate. If they're not responding to your voice, maybe there's a reason. Try different ways to communicate. Write things down. Use clear gestures. And most importantly, don't assume the worst. Not everyone who doesn't follow orders is being defiant. Sometimes they literally can't hear you. The training session lasted 2 hours. Keisha answered questions, demonstrated sign language, explained what it was like to navigate a world designed for hearing people. The recruits listened in a way that felt different from typical training. This wasn't just another lecture. This was real. This was someone who'd lived through their failure. When it was over, Officer Trainee Nash approached Keisha and Rita. Thank you for coming. I know this can't be easy. My little brother has autism, and I've seen how people misunderstand him. Your story, it's going to make me a better officer. I promise you that. Keisha signed and her interpreter relayed. That's all I want. For people to be better, to understand better, so no other kid has to go through what I did. Meanwhile, across town in the police department's new community outreach office, Officer Mitchell was working on something that had become his passion project. After what happened with Keisha, he couldn't go back to regular patrol work. The guilt ate at him. He'd pointed a weapon at a child. That wasn't who he wanted to be. That wasn't why he'd become a cop. So he'd requested a transfer to community outreach and thrown himself into building bridges between the police and the deaf community. He'd learned sign language, not just the basics, but actual fluent conversation. He'd attended deaf community events. He'd listened to stories of other encounters that had gone wrong. And he'd worked with Crystal, the department's first deaf liaison, to create new protocols. Today they were installing visual alert systems at the corner where Keisha had been stopped. Flashing lights that would activate when a patrol car's sirens were on. So deaf,